Welcome to the debate. Today, we are stepping onto the tatami to dissect a discipline that, well, it might just be the single greatest paradox in the history of martial arts. We are talking about Aikido.
Yeah, it really is.
Right. Because on one side of the coin, you have this martial system born directly from the quote-unquote hell dojo, which was a place of, bone-breaking, rigorous jujitsu designed for actual feudal combat. But then on the other side, you have an art that explicitly rejects the concept of defeating an enemy, framing itself instead as a search for peace.
It is the ultimate contradiction, isn't it? I mean, you have a system that teaches you exactly how to disconnect a person's joints and throw them through the floorboards, but then turns around and tells you the goal is to love them. It's incredibly confusing on the surface.
Exactly. And that brings us to the central question we are grappling with today, looking at our source material. Can a martial art truly exist without the intent to destroy? Is this philosophy of non-combat a profound evolution of human conflict, or, as critics have loudly suggested for years, does it risk becoming an abstract dance that has just lost all touch with the ugly, chaotic reality of violence?
Right.
I will be arguing that Aikido represents a higher level of martial understanding, where the goal is the transformation of violence into harmony.
And I will be taking the opposing view. I argue that without that martial rigor, without the acknowledgement of danger that we see in the El Dojo era, the philosophy of love becomes completely hollow. True harmony requires the capacity for destruction, a capacity that is voluntarily withheld.
Okay, so let's get into the position statements. To really understand my side of this, we have to look at the founder, Morihei Ueshiba, specifically his mature vision. The source text describes Aikido as a discipline where the aim is not to defeat an opponent, but to restore balance. This is crucial. When we talk about an attack in Aikido, my view, supported by the text, is that we shouldn't see it as a threat to be crushed, but as energy to guide. The material speaks of takamusu eiki, which is this capacity for spontaneous technique arising from principle rather than just rigid memorization. It isn't about memorizing how to hurt someone. It's about an internal state where the dojo is a mirror for the self. And honestly, the absence of competition, which people criticize all the time, is actually a feature, not a bug. It removes the ego's need to dominate.
See, I come at it from a completely different angle. You talk about restoring balance, but let's actually look at the mechanics described in the text. Aikido's roots are in Daito-ryu Jiu-Jitsu. This is a formidable, brutal art of joint manipulation and control. My position is that to understand peace, one must respect the original tension of the art. It was born from war.
Yes, but
Hold on, let me just finish this thought. I look at the Yoshinkan style mentioned in our text, founded by Gozo Shioda. That style emphasizes discipline as the path, with codified, distinct stages. Or the Iwama style, which insists on the heavy relationship between the sword and the empty hand. My overarching argument is that the modern tendency to over-soften the practice, to treat the attack as a gift, it robs the art of its honesty. If the atemi, the strike, is it real? If the attacker is just collaborating, then the technique is just choreography. You need the Hell Dojo intensity to make the piece real.
okay, I think we have a very clear delineation here. You view the martial efficacy as the strict prerequisite for the philosophy, whereas I view the philosophy as the engine that actually drives the efficacy. Let's move into the core debate, starting with that very concept of the attack. You mentioned the yuke, the person receiving the technique.
Right, the attacker. This is point one for me, the nature of the attack. The source material discusses the alphabet of attacks, grips, strikes, cuts. Now, in many modern dojos, the yuke is described as an active partner, offering movement. But look, if yuke is just offering movements the other person can look graceful, does the art lose its martial reality?
Well, it depends on what you mean by reality.
I mean physics. The text calls atemi strikes guiding lines rather than blows. That sounds beautiful, but I'm sorry, I just don't buy that as a martial concept if there is no threat of impact. If I'm punching you and my fist is just a guiding line with no intention of actually hitting your face, why would you move? Why would you need to harmonize? You could just stand there. That abstraction is dangerous. If the practitioner forgets, these are meant to be heavy impacts.
That's an interesting point, though I would frame it differently. The source material calls the attack a pedagogical language. It's not that the attack is fake, it's that the goal of the practice is to transform the reaction to the attack. Let me explain. If we turn every practice session into a street brawl, we never get past the fight or flight response. You stiffen up. The text introduces the concept of hanmi, the side stance, and ma'ai, the living distance. The argument here is that by positioning without opposing, you render the impact irrelevant before it lands. It's not about blocking a real punch with force. It's about being in a place where the punch simply occupies empty space.
Yeah, but a living distance, that only matters if the thing closing that distance is dangerous. Look at the section on tanto, the knife practice. The source explicitly says it evokes immediate closeness to attack. It mentions that even a wooden replica creates apprehension. My argument is that this fear, the sharp energy, is essential. It's not optional. If you treat the knife like a pedagogical tool and not a knife, you cultivate a false sense of security. You need that fear to test if you can actually remain calm.
I disagree that it cultivates a false sense of security. The consequence of failing in Aikido is the loss of one's center. If you panic, you lose. My perspective is that uke's role is described as active letting go. It teaches receiving in order to understand. If the attacker is purely trying to destroy the defender, the dialogue ends and a street fight begins. Aikido is trying to maintain that dialogue, even in conflict. By treating the attack as energy to guide, we move beyond the binary of winner and loser. The sharp energy of the tanto is there to refine perception, not to induce trauma. Merging is fine, but you have to merge with something substantial. If I'm coming at you with a knife, I'm not looking to merge, I'm looking to cut. And this leads us perfectly into the technical execution. You advocate for the spiral, the flow.
Absolutely. The spiral and tai sabaki, circular movement, they are the absolute heart of the art. The source material describes how linear attacks are converted into circular trajectories. Take shihonage, the four-direction throw, or sankyo. You aren't stopping the force, you are wrapping it into a spiral. The text highlights the Kobayashi style, noting fluidity as evidence, where technique arises from light contact and natural presence.
Light contact.
Right.
Yes, because kokyu, breath power, and the hara, your center, allow for a fluidity where technique disappears. If you are too focused on the martial rigidity you're talking about, you block the flow. You become a rock trying to stop a river rather than the water itself. That sounds poetic, but structure eats fluidity for breakfast if the structure isn't there first. I champion structure and axis. The Yoshinkan perspective in the text is discipline as a path. You need codified, distinct stages. You don't just flow into a technique, you build it step by step. And look at the concepts of omote and ura.
The entering and turning.
Exactly. Omote is entering in front. It is direct. It is immediate. My argument is that omote, that direct entry into the attacker's intention, is the martial reality. You have to be able to enter the danger zone. Only then does ura, the harmonious turning, make sense. If you only practice the turning, the spiral, you are just spinning in circles. You're dancing.
But omote and ura are two faces of the same movement, as the text explicitly says. They aren't opposing forces. One enters, one absorbs.
They are complementary, yes. But the bakken, the wooden sword, proves my point perfectly. The source says the sword requires decision and a cut. A cut is a line. It is an axis. If you only focus on the spiral without the cut, without that decisiveness, you lack the spirit of Iwama. You cannot have a spiral without an axis to turn around. That axis is the martial backbone. Without the capability to cut, the throw is completely fake.
I see the axis differently. The axis is the practitioner's vertical alignment, there she say. It's not a rigid rod, it's a column of breath. The source mentions that weapons practice in Aikido acts as an extension of the center. When we use the jo, the staff, it reveals the living spiral. The staff extends the body's rotations, so even the weapons work, which you cite as proof of rigor, is ultimately about continuity and fluidity. We aren't cutting flesh, we are cutting the space the attacker occupies.
Which brings us to the throws themselves, nagewaza, the paradox of control. You claim this is throwing without destroying.
Because it is. The trajectory isn't forced. The text says it appears when the attacker loses their access. When we look at immobilizations ozawaza, it's not about pinning someone down in submission like you'd see in judo or wrestling. It is described as stabilizing without constraining. Look at Nikkyo and Sankyo.
I am looking at them.
These are painful techniques if applied roughly, sure, but the text describes them as developing sensitivity, where the spiral settles the energy into calm. The goal is to bring the partner to the ground to restore their balance, not to break their arm.
Aikido is a wrist lock that, if applied with martial rigor, disconnects the wrist from the radius and ulna. It's a mechanism for breakage. I focus on the physicality of that connection. The source discusses grabs dori. It cites ryote dori, both hands held. That is a feeling of being immobilized. It is a struggle.
But grabs are about real constraint. If you pretend the constraint isn't there, you learn nothing. If I grab you, I am trying to control you. If you don't respect that physical reality, your quote-unquote sensitivity is just imagination.
But if I fight your grab with my own physical strength, I'm just playing your game. The sensitivity is sensing where your strength isn't. Fair. But consider Zanshin, the moment after technique. The text says this is where the true quality is revealed. Why? Because the bond isn't broken, and the potential for danger remains. You don't just let go and bow. You maintain inner continuity, because in a martial encounter, the fight isn't over until it's over. That proves it is a martial encounter. If it were just a spiritual exercise, the moment the throw finished, the connection would end. Zanshin implies a lingering threat.
Zanshin is indeed about continuity, but I would argue it's about the continuity of connection, not just paranoia about a counterattack. It's about remaining present in the void you just created. But I want to pivot to the final point of contention, which is how a practitioner actually evolves, the progression and the invisibility of rank.
This is where the idealism really shows its face. The text points out that Q ranks, the white belt, and even Shodan, the first black belt, are just disguised beginnings. My view is that real Aikido starts when you realize you know nothing. It's a struggle against one's own incompetence. It is a physical grind. You have to put in the reps.
It is a struggle, I won't deny that, but of what kind? I agree that the black belt is a beginning, but the text frames the higher levels, the Dan ranks, as a process of disappearance. The technique becomes invisible. The practitioner stops trying to prove anything. This supports my core argument. The ultimate form of the art is spiritual, not martial. Look at the hakama, the wide pleated pants worn by black belts. The text says it's not just ceremonial. It's a mirror that hides footwork but reveals the quality of presence. It symbolizes virtues like benevolence and loyalty. If the art were purely about fighting, we wouldn't need inner symbolism. We would just need efficient pants.
Come on, the hakama was originally worn by samurai. It was worn to hide footwork so the enemy couldn't predict their movement in a life-or-death sword fight. That is a tactical advantage, not just a spiritual symbol. We cannot whitewash the history here. The disappearance of technique at high levels happens because the mechanics are so internalized they become effortless, not because the martial intent has vanished. If you lose the martial intent, you aren't doing invisible technique, you're doing pantomime. A master makes it look easy because they are incredibly efficient at violence, not because they have transcended physics.
I think we are just looking at the exact same mountain from different sides. You see the rock and the steep climb, the mechanics, the pain, the history. I see the view from the summit, the flow, the connection, the peace.
And I'm saying you can't get to the summit if you don't climb the rock. You can't take a helicopter to the top of Aikido.
That's a compelling argument. But have you considered that the rock itself changes as you climb? The source material describes the diversity of styles, from the central thread of the Aikikai foundation to the vital energy of the Ki society. I believe this diversity proves the art is a path that unfolds. It's not static. If you stay obsessed with the Hell Dojo, you remain in hell. The ultimate goal described in the conclusion of our source is not fighting better, but walking without fighting.
Walking without fighting is a noble goal. I'm not disputing the destination, I'm disputing the vehicle. I stick to the summary in the text regarding the Awama style. It is a living root, To be valid, the art must respect its martial origins: the sword, the staff, the strike. Diversity is fine, but I believe styles like Shotokan, which actually introduce competition to test techniques, or Yoshinkan with its rigorous structure, are necessary anchors. They keep the fight honest within the flow. If everything becomes key society softness, we lose the anchor. We just float away into abstraction.
And I would counter that if everything remains Yoshinkan rigidity, we never learn to fly. We remain trapped in the conflict, endlessly polishing our weapons, but never transcending the need to use them.
Perhaps the tension between us is exactly the point. The source material seems to suggest that the art exists in that tension.
Precisely. The text concludes with a synthesis we can both probably agree on. Aikido is a transition from technique to an inner path. The dojo serves as a personal mirror.
Agreed. Whether you see that mirror reflecting a warrior preparing for war or a sage preparing for peace, the reflection is honest. If you cheat the technique, you see a cheat. If you commit to the attack, you see the truth. The true victory Ueshiba spoke of is the ability to pass through confrontation without losing one's center.
And that requires both the martial reality you champion to ground us and the spiritual vision I advocate to guide us. It seems the paradox of the peaceful warrior isn't a contradiction to be solved, but a balance to be maintained.
Well said. It's the structure that holds the flow.
Thank you for this rigorous exchange. It's clear that within the source material, there is room for both the sword and the open hand. To our listeners, we hope this debate illuminates the depth of Aikido beyond the surface.
It's always more complex than it looks. Keep training.
Until next time, this has been The Debate.